All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you for joining us for SMA StratCom speaker session entitled The Challenges of Multipolar Deterrence, Theory and Evidence. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Vipin Narang, for taking the time to speak with us today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. So during the brief or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon and it'll appear at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and submit all of your questions to Mariah Yeager today. Her name will appear as questions-Mariah Yeager. Go ahead and questions that are not submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send your questions to Mariah today. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question and it'll be read out loud before we address your question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Vipin Narang is a Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security and Political Science and is a member of the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was the recipient of the 2020 ISSS Emerging Scholar Award from the International Studies Association, which is awarded to the scholar who has made the most significant contribution to the field of security studies, it quotes. His current research interests include nuclear proliferation and strategy, North Korea's nuclear weapons, South Asian security, and general security studies. So Dr. Narang, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and I will stop sharing my slides. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go.
There we go.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks to everybody for coming. It's a real honor to be here. And I'm delighted to share some thoughts on what is essentially a new challenge, I think, in the post-Cold War era for the United States. And other states have had to confront, I think, these challenges in different ways. And we're going to talk a lot about the complexity of multipolar nuclear deterrence today and sort of unpack it a little bit, give some food for thought, and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. And the slides are really, designed to whet your appetite and I think, provide some fodder for sort of discussion and thoughts about these new challenges we face. And so I'm going to focus, I think, less on theory today and more on sort of types of multipolar nuclear deterrence to highlight and emphasize the complexity of this multipolar nuclear deterrence challenge in the new nuclear landscape, not just for the United States, but also for other countries in regional environments that may confront similar dynamics. And what I want to leave you with, if you leave just with one sort of sports center highlight here today, it's that there are different types of multipolar nuclear competitions and deterrence challenges, and they each sort of pose different risks and challenges for the deterrer. And in this case, the United States is obviously the one we're most concerned with. So where are we? What is the thinking on multipolar nuclear deterrence and the prospect of having to deter multiple nuclear actors, which is really what I'm restricting myself today to, right? So we've had multipolar conflict before, prior to World War I, World War II, but we haven't sort of had multipolar nuclear competitions with multiple nuclear actors having to deter each other and make calculations about their intentions and capabilities. And I would argue this is largely a post-Cold War challenge for the United States with an asterisk. And the Barry Bonds asterisk here is that the Soviet Union confronted multiple nuclear actors in the NATO alliance, in the Western alliance bloc during the Cold War, right? So it had to deter the United States, the United Kingdom, at least through 1958, which was an independent nuclear power, and at least as nominally an independent nuclear powers, despite historic cooperation, but also then France. And the Soviet move in the Cold War, which is why I think the current challenge is slightly different, is it basically treated the Western nuclear forces as one entity. And although the United States was worried about France starting a so-called catalytic nuclear war. I'll get back to that, I think, later in the presentation. But the United States was worried that France would start a nuclear war that the United States would have to finish between the Soviet Union and the United States. But from the Soviet perspective, deterring France, the United States, and the United Kingdom was really sort of a Western nuclear challenge, which the Soviet Union, for the most part, aggregated into a single sort of entity it had to deter. The United States during the Cold War did have a Soviet challenger as well as a Chinese challenger, although I would argue that it was the Chinese nuclear deterrence challenge was relatively minimal, particularly after the reopening to China in the 1970s. And it's not the same character that we face today. And so the multiple nuclear challenge, deterrence challenge, I think, is sort of unique for the United States today in ways it didn't confront during the Cold War. There's a great chapter by Caitlin Talmadge, my partner in nuclear crime at Georgetown University. We're working on several projects together, but she has really led the thinking on multiple nuclear challengers and deterrence, and has a chapter in a forthcoming volume that Scott Sagan and I are editing called The Fragile Balance of Terror, forthcoming with Cornell Press sometime next year. This is shameless self-promotion time. But really, I want to highlight Caitlin's chapter in there if you're interested in multipolar nuclear deterrence, where she sort of lays out the deterrence challenge and both the potential stabilizing effects of having multiple nuclear challengers, but also the destabilizing effects, and really focuses on the increased uncertainty in nuclear deterrence when you have multiple sort of challengers. What I want to do today is build on sort of her theory and sort of the brush clearing exercise she performs in that chapter, and highlight the different types of multipolar nuclear competitions that exist. Because there's sort of this, we use the phrase multipolar nuclear competition or multiple nuclear challengers and assume that it's just one uniform challenge that we might face. But what I want to leave you with is that there's a frightening amount of complexity in multipolar nuclear competitions, and that vary sort of across the power plane, the size of your adversary forces, the asymmetry of forces, and each of these configurations poses different risks. And all of these are sort of inductive in the sense that I'm identifying multipolar nuclear competitions that exist in the real world today. It doesn't mean they're exhaustive, although I think they do cover sort of the waterfront and the types of multipolar nuclear competitions that exist. So the first is really the classic multipolar nuclear competition that we think of, when we think about multipolar nuclear deterrence in the concept, right? The United States has to deter two peer nuclear competitors at the same time, Russia and China. And there's sort of this open question about whether it's triangular and Russia has to sort of deter China. I've sort of cut off that link because I'm taking this challenge, from basically the eye of a primary deterror, in this case, the United States, right? So we are now confronted with this problem of having to deter two peer nuclear powers at the same time, or at least a relative peer, if you place China in that category. And I leave open the possibility, of course, and we can talk about, if this is triangular, how much more uncertainty is introduced and injected into sort of the nuclear deterrence challenge. And the challenge here is in the Cold War and prior to sort of China's arrival as a pure nuclear power, the United States really had to size its force and its target set and its posture for a single peer adversary, Russia. Now it has to sort of size it for two. And what does that do for targeting? What does it do for force posture? What does it do for deployments? What does it do for uncertainty in the system, right? So how do you address the fact, for example, that targeting China with US ICBMs may require overflying Russian territory? And you have two peer nuclear competitors that you're trying to both deter and in some cases reassure one while deterring another in a crisis. If you're in a conflict, how does the third party, the other peer competitor, sort of see the conflict and engage with it? Does it sit out? Does it alert its nuclear forces? And now that you have to deal with an additional actor, it is much more complicated once you go from a two-player game to anything greater than that. So even a third player adds a lot more complexity to the system. I'll say this is sort of the classical multipolar nuclear deterrence case. One wrinkle is we're probably not in this classic case. What we are at is essentially a dynamic multipolar nuclear deterrence challenge at the moment, where China is not necessarily yet a pure nuclear competitor, but is a rising nuclear power that is trying to challenge and join the United States and Russia as sort of the major nuclear powers in the system. So how do you deal and deter with a rising China that attempts to join the ranks of sort of the top plane of nuclear powers, right? And the challenge today is not the classic multipolar nuclear deterrence challenge. It's that you have a rising nuclear competitor in China where its forces, which, you know, were extremely vulnerable to US counterforce and damage limitation measures, is attempting to break out of that, right? A US force that was sized for Russia puts a lot of pressure on the survivability and penetrability of the Chinese nuclear force. So China's sort of trying to make up for lost time now very quickly by expanding and diversifying its nuclear force, its penetrability. And the challenge the United States faces today is not a symmetric multipolar nuclear deterrence, a classical case. It's that you have a peer in Russia, and you're trying to deter a state that is rising and dynamically trying to join the top plane of nuclear powers. And deterring a rising power, forget nuclear, just managing the rise of any power, even without nuclear weapons, is very difficult as you undergo that power transition, right? There are preventive war incentives to sort of destroy the capability or the rising power before its power is so great that you can no longer do so, right? The windows of opportunity logic that is sort of underlies classic rising power theory and power transition theory. There's also the fact that China may not join eventually a symmetric level with Russia and the United States, but may always remain slightly beneath sort of the capabilities and force posture that the US and Russia have. It may not have the survivable SSBNs that the US and Russia, if Russia has survivable SSBNs. It may not have the diversity of land-based forces. It may not have a very capable air leg of a triad. And so it may be sort of a multipolar nuclear competition in character, but the form is very different if China is slightly below where the Russian and Chinese, or where the Russian and American forces are. And here the challenge is, for the United States, the force you develop and posture to deter Russia in order to sort of match the symmetry with Russia can look a lot more threatening to the rising challenger, especially as its forces are vulnerable, even as it's trying to expand them. And the expansion process, this very process of trying to join the ranks of the major nuclear powers, can sort of create crises or windows of prevention logic, windows of opportunity logic, where China may fear that in a crisis, the United States may use the opportunity to try to disarm or set back China's growth in nuclear forces. And so you have sort of, intra-crisis stability risks with one leg of this multipolar nuclear competition as sort of the rising nuclear power fears, preventive war logics, potentially use them or lose them fears in a crisis, all the while you have a peacetime arms race. And the challenge for the United States is it is hard to divine Chinese intentions and where, how it seeks to use its nuclear forces coercively or in a deterrent mode in a crisis or conflict. Is it attempting to stalemate the United States the way Russia does to open up the space for conventional conflict? Is it seeking to develop, which I think it's a long way from being able to do, but is it trying to develop sort of regional or theater counterforce capabilities? All of this uncertainty may lead sort of the established powers to seek superiority in ways that can lead to sort of spiraling arms races as well. So the dynamic multipolar nuclear deterrence challenge is actually what I think we face today, and is distinctly different from sort of this classical case that we have at the back of our minds. To add another wrinkle, what about asymmetric multipolar nuclear deterrence, right? So if the peer competition looks like this, and I cheated a little bit and put China back up on the symmetric plane here, only because North Korea is sort of so far below it. The United States actually, I think, has a much more difficult deterrence challenge than just sort of the two peer competitors that we often hear about that Admiral Richard has talked about, that General Milley has talked about. Russia and China as a peer competitor is one challenge, but the more likely point of conflict may be the asymmetric challenger, North Korea, right? Where the U.S. is sizing its force however it chooses to do so, posture its forces to deter Russia and China simultaneously, puts even more pressure on a North Korea whose force, it can't be confident is survivable in the face of U.S. conventional and nuclear counterforce and damage limitation measures. And you have, a wrinkle which is beyond just sort of the structural feature here, but personalist regime in North Korea where a command and control is a black box. And if in a perceived crisis or conflict, maybe in sort of manufactured in Kim's own head, North Korea can't be confident about its survivability and penetrability, although it's working very, very hard to catch up there as well. Even, this week we saw the first test of the Hwasong 8, which was a purported hypersonic glide vehicle to penetrate, fit that on top of an ICBM. And North Korea, could potentially have maneuverable warheads or hypersonic glide vehicles atop the ICBMs, the Hwasong 14 and 15. And this challenge is even more complicated than sort of the dynamic multipolar nuclear deterrence case, because how the U.S. chooses to posture and develop forces to deter what it thinks is just peer competitors can put a tremendous amount of pressure on the nuclear survivability and penetrability of a state where the risk of a crisis or conflict may be even greater than it is with China or Russia at any given moment because of sort of the unpredictability of North Korea and how quickly sort of a crisis can ramp up with North Korea and Kim Jong-un. And so the challenge we face today, I would argue, is even more complicated and risky than sort of our stereotypical picture of multipolar nuclear deterrence, where you now have not just a single peer competitor, but you have a rising or equal nuclear peer competitor. We also have adversaries who are trying to deter at a much more asymmetric level, North Korea, which we did not have to do in the Cold War. We have never had to simultaneously deter a recognized peer competitor, state that is attempting to become a peer competitor, and a state that can never become a nuclear peer competitor, but which has hostile and adversarial relations with the United States. So all of this puts pressure sort of not just on our forces, but how, sort of to optimally posture so that in a potential crisis or conflict with one, you're not exacerbating use them or lose them fears or preventive war logic with the others, and how you deter one of these competitors while trying to reassure others is a significant challenge. And I'll get back to another wrinkle with this towards the end. Another sort of example at the regional level, which sort of has implications, I think, for U.S. crisis management, is another form of asymmetric multipolar nuclear deterrence, right? So India faces a challenge which is distinct from the United States because India is sort of in between where China and Pakistan is in terms of nuclear forces, right? So even if you think India has some advantage in terms of its reliability and size of nuclear force, and certainly in its aggregate capability against Pakistan, right? These may be closer to peer nuclear competitors than depicted here. But India has to simultaneously deter a weaker power Pakistan and a stronger power China, putting it sort of in the middle. And when India tested nuclear weapons in 1998, it sort of cited China as the reason to develop nuclear weapons and always saw China as a harder power to deter because it didn't have at the outset, and still today doesn't have sort of the reliable nuclear forces to hold at risk Chinese strategic targets on the eastern seaboard. And so India is seeking a capability against China to deter it, which India views as its major power. But doing so sort of puts pressure on Pakistan, right? While India claims to have, a credible minimum deterrent, because of this asymmetric multipolar nuclear deterrent problem, what looks credible and minimum to China looks anything but minimum to Pakistan. And so you're in trying to develop, the minimum means of reprisal or a credible minimum deterrent against China, India is putting a lot of pressure on Pakistan, exacerbates sort of crisis risk with Pakistan simply by virtue of trying to have a credible minimum deterrent against China, right? So Pakistan fears that the capabilities that India is developing to deter China in a minimal way, India claims, can all of a sudden look like counterforce against Pakistan, right? You have a lot of capability that can be sort of used. MIRVs have a logic for India against China if you're worried about the survivability of missiles. And so you can have more throw weight against China if you have some of your long-range missiles getting attritted. But Pakistan sees that and says, well, I can't attrit India's long-range missile force, but if those are lofted, and have multiple warheads, those become, very, capable counterforce weapons against a strategic nuclear force in Pakistan that is like tens of, nuclear systems as opposed to tens of thousands, which is what sort of the U.S. has to deal with Russia. And right, so India's deterrence challenge is, how do you deter China without sort of putting peacetime arms race pressure on Pakistan or crisis risk pressure on Pakistan? I would say this is different than sort of the U.S. case. Another wrinkle is, well, what if India is in a conflict with Pakistan? And China and Pakistan have sort of an all-weather friendship, as they like to refer it to. And this is what I call protective multipolar nuclear deterrence. Whether there's sort of a formal extended deterrence guarantee from China to Pakistan or not, India has to worry about the possibility that China will sort of come into any conflict that is intense enough to risk nuclear escalation. And India's challenge then becomes deterring Pakistan and a China that has come in to protect it, right, as a more powerful nuclear actor, a more powerful third party, in a way that complicates India's nuclear planning. Now, the United States doesn't have to deal with this because it doesn't have a more powerful sort of third party in the system above it. But there are scenarios in which, for example, the United States may have to worry about this kind of dynamic, right? So India's challenge is it has to size its forces for potential Chinese nuclear assistance or intra-crisis extended deterrence to Pakistan, right? And I call this protective multipolar nuclear deterrence because China is a more powerful actor than either of the participants in the crisis. The US challenge is sort of assistive or extended multipolar nuclear deterrence. What happens if in a crisis or conflict with North Korea, China sort of comes in as a blocking force with third-party nuclear guarantee or third-party nuclear assistance, and the United States is still the more powerful of the three nuclear actors, but now you have to aggregate sort of these forces. In this case, sort of the Indian case, this may be what how the Soviet Union had to think about a conflict with France that would escalate, where the United States would replace China and Pakistan here during the Cold War. But the US problem today, which I think is distinct, is any conflict with North Korea may not be limited to sort of North Korea, and you may sort of get this aggregate of a more powerful nuclear force than North Korea, China, that sort of engages in extended nuclear deterrence with another nuclear power. So when we think of extended deterrence, that's why I hesitate to use the term extended deterrence here. Extended deterrence is usually a nuclear power extending deterrence to a non-nuclear power. But here we would have sort of nuclear protection or assistance from one nuclear power to another, essentially the way the United States in the Cold War would have behaved with Britain and France. And so how do you size your force and think about the possibility that in a conflict with North Korea that has sort of tinges of intense conventional or nuclear risks of nuclear escalation, that China may come in assistively and force the United States to deter these two powers simultaneously? And so I'm going to stop here because I've gone on for a while and I want to leave time for sort of discussion and questions. And what I want to leave you with is sort of each of these configurations in multiple nuclear deterrence sort of challenges is unique, has unique risks, and poses different challenges for the United States and for policy. And they each have different sort of risks, right? So in classical multipolar nuclear deterrence, you have uncertainty about sort of deterring two actors at the same time. There's more uncertainty in the system, sizing your force, targeting challenges, reassuring one peer competitor while trying to deter another. But the upside may be that if China is confident it's in pure nuclear power, it may be amenable to sort of tripartite arms control in ways that, as in the dynamic regime that we're in now, it is unlikely to ever accept, right? As China is rising, right, the real challenge now is not, I would say, Russia, although there are certainly contingencies with Russia that one has to concern oneself with, but we know how to sort of deter Russia. Our force is sized for it. We spent 70 years thinking about it. But the dynamic challenge now, I think the more acute challenge is how do you deal with the rising nuclear power with China that is increasing its forces, that is worried about vulnerability. Its intentions are unclear. And it's unlikely, because it's a rising nuclear challenger, in addition to a rising major power challenger, to accept limits on its nuclear forces and growth, because it refuses to accept sort of locking in inequity, and probably is not amenable to arms control agreements until there's near parity. And so arms control in this sort of regime that we're in now with China is sort of probably unlikely. The asymmetric multipolar nuclear deterrence problem, I think, is sort of derived from the Indian challenge, but the U.S. faces this in multiple very, very complicated ways, right? It's not just China and Russia that the U.S. has to deter, with China rising. So you have a dynamism with China, but you also have this asymmetric nuclear challenger with North Korea, where North Korea may perceive and probably objectively has reasons to worry about survivability and penetrability against the U.S. conventional nuclear forces. And what looks like sort of peer deterrence to China and Russia may put a lot of pressure on the adversary with whom you're more likely to have a conflict, where the risk of escalation is actually much higher. And so the challenge here is that even though North Korea may be the weakest of the nuclear challengers, the risk of nuclear escalation may be the greatest, because any sort of conflict forces North Korea to flex out and transform what may be a very assertively managed force in peacetime, but into a very forward-leaning delegative force at the hint of a crisis, because Kim Jong-un cannot be confident that he would survive, the forces would survive, or that he may be able to maintain command and control over them and positive control over them in a conflict or crisis. And so there may be incentives to use or lose very quickly in this sort of asymmetric nuclear dyad with the North Korea. And you add this complication that if that happens, there's always the possibility that China comes in sort of this assistive nuclear deterrence mode, which would really complicate, I think, a conflict in U.S. deterrence challenges. And then you have these protective dynamics that India faces with China and Pakistan. Has to be concerned, however remotely, that China may sort of assist Pakistan in a crisis or conflict as a nuclear deterror. And then assistive extended deterrence, which is really the Chinese case with North Korea. And all of this is to say, disaggregating this concept of multipolar nuclear deterrence, I think, is really important, because all of these are sort of distinct. You can layer them on top of each other. And when you do, you see a lot more complexity, a lot more risk in the system. And I don't envy those that have to sort of, in practice, devise a posture and a strategy to deter all of these adversaries simultaneously, and accounting for the possibility of assistive and protective nuclear deterrence by a third party that is also simultaneously sort of an adversary in the Chinese and North Korean case. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions and answers. This is just sort of like the tip of the iceberg on the multipolar nuclear deterrence challenge. Happy to talk about specifics and crises if that's useful. But let's open it up and start getting your thoughts and questions. So thank you very much, and I will stop sharing now.
All right, thank you, Dr. Narang. Let me adjust the screen view real quick. Okay, so we'll now move on to the Q&A portion of today's Zoom Gov session. So please feel free to keep submitting your questions to questions-Mariah Yeager. All right, so this first question is going to come from Todd Veazey. And the question is, would you describe how questions about a state's nuclear force survivability drives its strategic choices and doctrine? For example, what do we know about China and North Korea's thinking in this regard?
Great, thanks, Todd. Great week to ask this question, especially North Korea. So in the last couple of months, at least publicly, and I think, at least for, at least a year, it's been clear that China is rapidly trying to make up for lost time on the survivability question. I mean, I think, when you rely on several dozen hardened fixed silos, for land-based survivability, and you haven't run sort of a deterrent patrol, and this is sort of China in the early for the last through the 2010s. If you're facing sort of a potential conventional conflict with the United States and you're China, you may not be confident that you can stalemate the United States at a nuclear level, right? So China may have been the poster boy for sort of the theory, the so-called theory of the nuclear revolution, right? That a minimal force is sufficient to sort of deter even a major nuclear power like a nuclear superpower like the United States, because how much risk is a president willing to accept? A single sort of DF-5 warhead on Los Angeles or headed towards Los Angeles is a pretty, terrifying deterrent, or so the Chinese believe. But I think, it's sort of, to me, related to what they're, and this gets to some other questions I think I see in the chat. The timing and speed of the Chinese expansion, I think, gives us some indication, at least from my view, of their assessment of the risk of a conventional conflict with the United States in the coming years. That they think it's more likely. And in order for China to sort of open up the space it wants to in that conventional conflict, whether it's maritime or amphibious or whatever it may look like, it can't do so under sort of American nuclear Damocles, right? It has to stalemate the United States at the nuclear level so that it can open up the space to be more aggressive at the conventional level. And to me, that's sort of the rationale for why China is seeking to make up for lost time with survivability. And your question, I think, is deeper. So how does it do that? We always assume that SSBNs are the way to do that, but there's SSBNs, as we've seen in the Chinese case, are hard to make quiet, hard to build in numbers. Your tube limited SLBM technology has been a challenge for them. SSBN technology has been a challenge for them. They have a limited coastline. We got pretty good at tracking the Soviet boomers, and the Soviets had the advantage of sort of the Siberian shore, the entire coast, where there are choke points for US ASW. Chinese SSBN access is limited to several ports that we know, and they could be very, very vulnerable to US ASW. So it's not a foregone conclusion, I think, for most nuclear powers now that don't already have SSBNs, right? Really China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, that SSBNs are really the ticket to survivability. And these are countries that have long thought about what survivability on land might look like. Rapidly expanding your silos, whether you plan to fill them out or engage in a shell game or whatever, I think that at least initially, China may not have enough missiles to fill every silo, but eventually they might. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But either way, numbers and deception and camouflage are pretty good sort of ticket to survivability on land, and you layer mobility on that, right? And if you're China, yeah, we can target fixed silos, but it sort of commits us, 400 fixed silos commits anywhere from, let's call it 400 to 800 warheads when you're New Start limited to destroying fixed silos. And that frees up sort of survivability of the mobiles, and it frees up survivability of the SSBN. So I can see why China's working on mobility and fixed silos at the same time. From a command and control perspective, they might prefer fixed silos, right? The LCCs are probably fixed LCCs are probably much more in line what we think of in terms of Chinese preferences on command and control and assertiveness. And so what we're seeing is sort of China catching up late to the game in ways that aren't completely irrational if you're China. So land-based silos, when you have, the vast territory that China does, I don't think it doesn't matter if the U.S. can see it. It's sort of in line with, our thinking on fixed silos also. One, they're prompt. They can be survivable. They sort of force the adversary to hit the homeland to start attriting forces. And a large number of nuclear warheads have to be committed to destroying the fixed silos. And it opens up survivability of your land-based mobiles and potentially your SSBNs and air leg as well. And so I see China pushing on all of that. And on the penetrability side, we're already seeing sort of the hypersonic glide vehicles, MIRVs and MARVs, all of which complicate homeland missile defense. And North Korea is doing exactly the same thing, right? So I don't think for a second North Korean sub is at all survivable. I don't think the North Koreans think that. I think they had some success with the SLBM program, though. And the Pukasong family of solid fuels, it probably started as SLBMs, but they could be very useful as land-based medium range and long range missiles as well. And you can sort of graft them onto land. And North Korea is working on mobility. We're seeing road mobiles, road and rail mobile solid fuel missiles. I think the big sort of takeaway for me, and just digesting it, and I had to go read about this, to get my bearings on ampulization. But we, saw this hint yesterday from North Korea with this new hypersonic test of the Hwasong 8, that they ampulized the liquid fuel, the booster, right, by canisterizing it and hermetically sealing it, which sort of solves their survivability of the liquid fuel problem, because it doesn't take hours to fuel those where they're very vulnerable. They can do it in factory and then, flush them out very promptly. And so survivability, promptness, penetration are sort of the things we expect China and North Korea to be working on in the face of sort of US conventional and nuclear counterforce and missile defenses. And that's exactly what they're doing. None of this is really a surprise to me. But then the lingering question is, why now for China? North Korea, fine, they're so far behind, they have no choice. But there is sort of this unsettling question about China had lived with vulnerability that it knew it was living with for a long time. But why is China today sort of investing so rapidly in this nuclear expansion, the silos, other mobile systems? And what does it say, not about the nuclear forces, but about their assessment of the possibility of a conventional conflict with the US in the coming years, right? If the aim of all of these forces is to essentially stalemate the US at the nuclear level, what that does do is open up the space for China to be more aggressive at the conventional level. And that to me is sort of the big concern with the Chinese expansion. It's not the expansion itself, but what it says about China's own assessment about the risk of conflict with the US coming down the pipeline. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
No worries. It was an insightful one, so thank you. So I think that you're leading into the answer to Raymond Wiggins' question, which is how likely is that the dynamic nature of China's nuclear capability will result in it surpassing Russia and the US?
I'm not sure that China's aim is to surpass the US and Russia. And I'm not sure, I think China looks back and says, well, we don't need to compete with the US and the old Soviet force. We don't need tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. We don't need tactical nuclear weapons because we're not worried about a ground invasion, right? I do think there may be interest in theater nuclear weapons, right, on the DF-26. But I wouldn't, I don't know that the Chinese, this remains to be seen, but I don't think that I don't take it as a given that the Chinese are trying to match warhead for warhead and system for system the United States. I think the Chinese have long lived with a lot of vulnerability of their strategic nuclear force and have decided that they probably face too much vulnerability, and that there is sort of a configuration where that vulnerability essentially asymptotically goes to zero. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at the same level as the United States or Russia. And again, that's not really sort of the take home, right? The take home for me is not the numbers or the diversity of systems, although that's concerning. It's what it says about China's intentions and what it thinks is the prospect for sort of conflict with the United States. Because I think it's sort of, there was a view, you could have told yourself a story 10 or 15 years ago that China lives with that vulnerability because it sees the prospect for an actual crisis that escalates to conventional conflict or shooting war with the US is very, very low. And I think the timing of this sort of expansion now, to me, is more of an insight into the Chinese reassessment of that risk. And they may still have a view, right? And I do want to say one thing, because you keep hearing this sort of conclusion that China no longer believes in minimal deterrence, where minimal deterrence was sort of a size-based characterization of the Chinese force. I think if you look more closely at Chinese thinking on nuclear strategy, minimum deterrence isn't quite what the Chinese described it as, the minimum means of reprisal, which is what was a minimum force required to be able to retaliate with plausibility or certainty against the United States. And the numerical requirements and capabilities required to do that are dynamic, right? So they could have probably done that with what looked like a minimal force, but the minimum means of reprisal now are much larger. And so now the problem is we can't distinguish between whether the force they seek is the minimum means of reprisal or something more, right, to actually coerce the United States. And there's an open question. I think it's certainly the case that it's no longer minimum deterrent if you use a size-based estimate, right? There are questions about where it's going to get the fissile material. I mean, those are real questions. I think I'm less sort of, I'm not optimistic about, as in, I think if China needs fissile material for its nuclear weapons rapidly, there are sources, and not going to be able to build warheads for 400 ICBMs overnight, but in the next several years to decade, China may be able to get there. So I don't think it's a prohibitive constraint, but using a size-based estimate or indicator for sort of China's thinking, yeah, okay, it's no longer minimum and a size-based character. But it is still possible that, they are pursuing a force which they have estimated is required for sort of the minimal means of reprisal, be able to survive and then penetrate with certainty against U.S. homeland targets. And that number has certainly increased over time. And so maybe they're just saying, okay, that's the number and the diversity of force that we need is X. We need to get to X. It is also possible that they may overshoot X, right? We don't know. So I still leave open the possibility that the broad contours of Chinese strategy are still minimum means of reprisal. But as the growth is occurring, there is no way to sort of distinguish that from and extrapolate, where they're going to stop. And so we have to leave open both possibilities. I think that's the only sort of rational thing to do. And, if you're worst casing it, then you can't assume that it's any more sort of the minimum means of reprisal either, right? So I understand why, from a planning perspective, you can't make any assumptions about where they're going to stop. But, there is certainly the possibility that, it's simply that their assessment of what the requirements for the minimum means of reprisal have changed, or they've decided they have to meet them after long living with a lot of vulnerability. And then you ask yourself why. But, it's impossible in real time sort of to distinguish between, sort of that sort of thinking that it's still the minimum means of reprisal or something more concerning.
All right, thank you, Dr. Narang. Our next question comes from Chris Ferrero, and this question is, how do we account for the asymmetries of motivation that favor the adversary? For example, China will perceive an asymmetry of motivation in Taiwan, and Russia may calculate the same in some parts of Eastern Europe. This has always been an issue, but is exacerbated by multipolarity.
Yes, that's true. So I think fundamentally the issue of stakes and resolve are the same. The complexity is whether, there becomes sort of an additional nuclear actor with stakes in a conflict that didn't exist before. So in the Baltic scenario, I think China sits out. China is very happy to let Russia and the US bait and bleed each other. I think over Taiwan, Russia probably sits out, right? Because Russia would be very happy to let China and the US bait and bleed each other over Taiwan. So I don't see sort of overlapping stakes in some of the flashpoints that we've had in the past. The complexity now is sort of, as if you think that a conflict over Taiwan is more likely now, right, as China is sort of building up its nuclear force to stalemate the US, but then you sort of get in, in anticipation of this flashpoint in ways that may not have been the case before. There are sort of geographical concerns that one has to address, right? The overflight of Russian territory with US ICBMs onto Chinese targets. There would be sort of, you think back to Dr. Strangelove, right? Dmitry, they're not for you. It's sort of, how do you reassure Russia in a crisis or a conflict that, we don't consider the aggregate target set with China and Russia if we want Russia to sort of stay out of it. And so, the asymmetry in stakes has long sort of been, a hallmark of nuclear deterrence, right? Berlin in the Cold War, the Baltics in Russia today, Taiwan with the United States, and then for the North Korean case, right? There's sort of we have an extended deterrence commitment to South Korea. As long as that persists, we have a stake in peace on the Korean Peninsula. China's interest in that sort of affects its calculation. What are its stakes in the independence of North Korea as a buffer zone? That implicates whether China would find itself sort of engaging in a conflict between North Korea and the United States. And I think that's sort of where the stakes question that you raise is probably the most salient. And whether China judges that it's in its interest to sort of serve as a blocking function in a crisis or conflict with North Korea and the United States. And I mean, there are reasons to think it won't. North Korea and China have a very, very complicated relationship, despite what the Friendship Treaty may say. I mean, China's as sort of bothered by North Korean tests as we are. I think one of the reasons Kim Jong-un has become an independent de facto nuclear weapons power is to gain independence from Beijing. And that has probably annoyed Beijing to no end. Nevertheless, Kim's first stops have been Beijing. And so, there is, this is a complexity I think we have to sort of account for. Whether it's likely or not, I think is sort of depends on the stakes and, where China is in its relationship with North Korea at the time.
All right, thank you. Hannah Hageland has asked how this multipolar environment impacts the future of nuclear restraint norms.
Hi, Hannah. Great question. And thanks for it. Good to see you. I think we hit an inflection point on sort of norms on nuclear restraint several years ago. It all sort of happened around 2017, I would say, but I think it predated it. I think Russian violations of the INF Treaty with 9M729, Russian nuclear modernization, Chinese nuclear modernization, and then the arrival of North Korea as a declared, sort of nuclear weapons power, if not nuclear weapons state, in 2017 with the Sprint. And it's not just because, we did have a presidential election and we had a new president, but I don't think it was because of President Trump. And we had a lot of this predated 2016 and 2017, although I think North Korea's Sprint was in part motivated by a fear that Kim Jong-un needed to reach certain milestones very quickly before the U.S. engaged in a preventive war. And so I don't see any state in the system reducing its nuclear weapons numbers or modernization, right? Even the United Kingdom, good old UK, which had never owned the nuclear headlines as far as I can remember, had its day in the sun this summer when it announced that it wasn't going to keep going down was a 180. And so it announced, it was sitting probably around 225 and it was going to raise the ceiling to 260, right? So we were seeing sort of a secular decline in everyone's nuclear forces until, the mid 2010s. And then Russian modernization, our modernization, which is still continuing and will continue, and Chinese modernization, the arrival of North Korea, India, Pakistan, still going gangbusters on all sorts of capabilities. India flirting with counterforce and damage limitation. Pakistan with tactical nuclear weapons. France is going to France. But even good old United Kingdom. United Kingdom was, I think, everybody's poster child for, there's still one country that believes in minimal deterrence. But Britain really does. 260 doesn't really do anything more for the United Kingdom. But, just this notion that the UK wasn't going to decline, but was going to raise its ceiling, sort of put all the nuclear weapons powers in the same category of this, nuclear weapons are back. And there's pressure on states to modernize their forces, think very carefully about posture. And so we're no longer seeing sort of the secular decline and de-emphasis of nuclear force. I think nuclear weapons now are, as much as some, or we may want to de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy, it is impossible now to do so with the number of peer competitors and rising competitors, North Korea, in the landscape we see today, to sort of elide over the fact that nuclear weapons are sort of central to U.S. national security, global stability in ways that, that are increasingly risky. Managing this landscape is very, very difficult. But so long as we have nuclear weapons, we're going to need people to manage them, because this landscape looks a lot more complex and with a lot more inherent risk than I think we've had since the end of the Cold War.
All right, thank you, Dr. Narang. So I've got 3 questions lined up. Hopefully we'll be able to finish those before the end of the hour.
Yep.
And for everyone else that submitted your questions, thank you so much. We have a ton of questions. So I will try to get to as many as I can.
And I should say, please do feel free. I'm an academic. I love hearing from everybody. So my email address is on the MIT website. It's narangv@mit.edu. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'll try to get to it quickly, but hopefully eventually. I love hearing from everybody. So if I didn't get to your question, please do shoot me an email, and I'm happy to sort of engage further.
You can also email me if you'd like at npeterson@nsiteam.com. All right. So our question is from Frag at the Air Force A3. And this question is, do you think that official declarations on no first use policies have any real effect on adversary decision calculus about what we might or might not do in a crisis?
Nope, zero.
I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about them, but it's
I can
not
make it quick.
I mean,
sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that question. Was there something else?
It's okay. I think it's getting at your answer.
No, so I cut my teeth on India and China, essentially, mostly India, both of whom have no first use declarations. So Caitlin and I are actually writing a paper on adversary perceptions of no first use using sort of, there was a Soviet declaration, which we never believed. There's the Indian declaration and the Chinese declaration. The Chinese declaration, you kind of ask anybody, raise their hand if you believe the Chinese no first use declaration, and nobody raised their hands. The Indians don't believe it. The US doesn't believe it. Japan doesn't believe it, right? Because nothing physically stops a state with nuclear weapons from using them first in a crisis, no matter what sort of peacetime. And China took, a lot of measures to sort of make their NFU declaration credible, demating forces. But in a crisis or conflict, you have to assume those are going to be generated. And as soon as those are generated, there's nothing physically stopping a state with nuclear weapons from using them first if they believe, it's in their national interest. The Indian case is the most interesting, and I'm not going to go on my 15-minute rant about the Indian case, but, India had sort of this sort of no first use from the beginning. They had caveats from the beginning about chem bio and, whether they had exceptions for preemption. And like Pakistan never believed it. China never believed it. And we're now at the point where India doesn't even believe it, right? So India doesn't even believe its own no first use declaration. And what Caitlin and I sort of conclude with a great co-author at Georgetown, master's student, Lisa McAnally, is that where you need a no first use declaration to reassure an adversary, it's never credible. Like what you need to do to make it credible is almost impossible. And so, it's difficult to make, it's almost impossible to make credible to your adversaries. And in the US case, we have this added complication, which is why I'm not a supporter of no first use. We have extended deterrence and allies, right? So you're really worried, your adversaries don't believe it under pretty much any scenario or circumstance, but your allies might, and that puts you in sort of the worst of all worlds. And, what does it buy you to declare a no first use? There are modeling arguments. My academic mentor, Scott Sagan, has written why the US should declare no first use, but I'm not convinced that the modeling, the modeling benefits offset sort of the disruption to US extended deterrence, which is already questionable in the last several years. And, especially coupled with the fact that it doesn't reassure the adversaries or make crises more stable because they never believe it, right? Especially with the US. I mean, what would the US have to do to make an NFU declaration credible is a question that I don't think I've heard a convincing answer to. I mean, it's not just demating forces, and you'd have to eliminate entire legs of the triad, and no one is going to do that, right? So I don't see any way in which the US could make it credible to adversaries. And you have this added problem, you blow a hole through US extended deterrence. So I'm always happy to talk about no first use.
All right, thank you, Dr. Narang, and thank you, Frag, for asking that question that Dr. Narang was so keen on.
I'll send you the check in the mail.
All right, so this next question comes from Michael, and the question is, how do novel non-nuclear weapons like hypersonic, cyber, and space weapons complicate nuclear deterrence?
A lot. I mean, I think, again, we're getting into, the buzzword previously was cross-domain deterrence, right? So, what happens, and we used to think of that as, okay, use nuclear weapons to deter conventional conflict. That's cross-domain deterrence. Or, you use, there was concern we'd use nuclear weapons to deter cyber attacks, which I don't think is credible. And, there's now space weapons. And I think the risk is not so much this idea of using one domain to deter another. It's sort of the penetration of the domains with each other, right? So for me, the big concern is sort of cyber effects on nuclear operations, right? And if I were sort of an adversary, I'd worry about the US ability to render their command and control completely, to neutralize command and control with cyber, right? That we used to talk about conventional or nuclear counterforce that needed and required big boom. But what if there are ways that other adversaries could neutralize their command and control with cyber attacks or vice versa, right? We're in a new era where sort of these technologies and domains can infect each other. And it's not sort of, that's why the cross domain sort of still saw the domains as separate. All the domains are sort of interlinked now in ways that, and it's sort of gotten a bad name, this concept of integrated deterrence, but I think that's sort of what it's getting at. It's cross webs of deterrence. Integrated deterrence is getting at sort of the horizontal integration of these capabilities and sort of, how they can be deployed and employed to deter the vertical spectrum of conflict. And a lot intellectually, I think still needs to be worked out, but I think we're in new terrain on this. Because our old concepts of cross-domain, where we saw the domains as distinct and identifiable, are no longer as applicable. And I know that's not a satisfactory answer to this question, because I don't think there is one. I think we are not equipped to deal with these challenges. Academia we don't have the production of people to do this and think about it, because we've had, so much lost time where people thought nuclear weapons weren't irrelevant anymore. But here we are, and now we don't, we have all these new challenges, and not enough manpower to sort of think about them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Narang. Okay, so I wanted to end with this question, and we may have time for another one depending on your answer. But the question is from Belinda, and she asks how you define successful strategic deterrence.
The non-use of nuclear weapons. I think there are various indicators. That's a good question. I think deterrence is stable. At a meta level, obviously, when nuclear weapons don't have to be used, that's number one. I think there's another indicator which is not easy to observe, but when both sides are inhibited from starting crises that run the risk of escalation. I think general stability, general deterrent stability, is far more than our nuclear weapons, and stable nuclear deterrence really has its greatest benefits when both sides, or at least the adversary, is deterred from picking fights, because there is the concern about conventional escalation that runs the risk of sort of further escalation. And in that sense, is deterrence stable today with Russia and China? I don't know. I think it's probably less stable than it has been in the past. I think China is more willing to be aggressive. I think we're more willing to be aggressive. I think that Russians are more willing to be aggressive, certainly in the Baltics and Eastern Europe. And so does that mean a deterrence breakdown is inevitable? No, but it does mean that sort of the inhibitory effects of strategic nuclear weapons are being sort of pushed in ways that they haven't been for a while, right? We've seen this during the Cold War, right, where we went through periods of what we thought were general deterrent stability and not. But in the post-Cold War era, right, for the most part, the United States didn't have to deal with pure aggression until, for 25 years. And so here we are, and now I think a little late catching up to sort of the pressure we are now facing on the stability of general nuclear deterrence.
All right, thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. So let's squeeze one in. Let's go with this question. Let's go with the question from Dennis Murphy. And this question is, it seems like China is acting as a loose patron to North Korea and Pakistan in this dynamic system. To me, it seems like a setup that gives them a lot of benefits. Do you think that they would ever willingly give up this position?
No. Unless they're pushed away. I think in the North Korean case, we saw such a deterioration in the relationship between Kim Jong-un and Beijing that it was possible. But so long as North Korea is sort of willing to be sort of at worst a problem child, I think Beijing still values North Korea as an independent buffer against Western forces. I think Pakistan is the gift that keeps on giving for China, right? It sort of locks India down to its west. And now with sort of the access to the stands, Pakistan is sort of the I would say lily pad, but it's land, it's not lily pad. It's sort of like the jumping off point for China, right? And China, we've seen PLA forces in Pakistan. The relationship between China and Pakistan on sort of, forget nuclear weapons, the transfer of HEU, bomb designs, is unprecedented in the annals of nuclear history. But Pakistan can be a very valuable sort of foothold for China not just to lock down India, which is how it started, but now sort of as China wants access to the natural resources, forget Afghanistan, but beyond that, right? And I don't see that ever going away because Pakistan needs China as a sort of all-weather friend. The reason Pakistan can sort of behave the way it does with the United States is because it knows it has China sort of as a patron lurking in the background. That won't go away. They refer to each other as all-weather friends. I don't think the U.S. has all-weather friends. I thought, maybe the United Kingdom, but even France is not an all-weather friend, apparently. So, it's a very tight relationship between China and Pakistan. I don't see that breaking structurally.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Narang. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave our audience with, or?
No, huge thanks to everybody who came. I mean, I'm really honored you took the time. And I mean it, if you have any questions, follow-ups, if you think anything I said was really stupid, feel free to email me and just let me know. And I look forward to it. Hope this has been useful for everybody. And I want to thank you guys for having me.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Narang. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.